We're delighted to host archaeologist and art historian Dr. Joanna S. Smith as she discusses ancient art from Cyprus and the Mediterranean. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Cartwright, Chief Curator, and Ulla R. Searing, Curator of Collections, who will open today's program and welcome our speaker. Dr. Cartwright.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to see you all here today. Thank you for coming. What a wonderful turnout for Joanna Smith, and I couldn't be more delighted that we have this lecture taking place today. To introduce Dr. Smith, so many things I could say, but I will not lack in talking about her credentials first. So Dr. Joanna S. Smith is an archaeologist and curator of ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern art, and the Ringling's consulting curator for its collection of Western antiquities. Joanna received her AB from Princeton University and her MA and PhD from Bryn Mawr College. She is the author of 5 books, including Art and Society in Cyprus from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age of 2009, and more than 50 articles. She has worked on archaeological projects on Cyprus since 1988, primarily as part of the Princeton University excavations at Polis Chrysochous. After nearly 25 years of teaching ancient art and archaeology, she decided in 2020 to center her work on publication and on bringing the arts of Cyprus to the public through museum exhibitions and their online resources. Dr. Smith has been working with the Ringling as consulting curator since 2014, researching the museum's collection of ancient art and curating the new Gallery 12, Ancient Art from Cyprus and the Mediterranean. That gallery is the first fully interpreted permanent installation of antiquities from the museum's collection, which, as you all know, had a soft opening last fall, and we're celebrating its official opening this week. Previously, Joanna curated the exhibition Views from Flamoudi, focused on the archaeological discoveries at Flamoudi, Cyprus, for the Wallach Art Gallery at Columbia University and the Cyprus Museum in Nicosia, Cyprus. She also co-curated City of Gold, Tomb and Temple in Ancient Cyprus for the Princeton University Art Museum, as well as the Eastern Mediterranean Gallery, a permanent gallery for the Penn Museum, which opened in 2022. She's currently also a consulting curator for the Metropolitan Museum of Art's project to reinstall its permanent galleries of the arts of Cyprus and the ancient Near East. Joanna began consulting for us here soon after I arrived, and it has been my extreme good fortune to have worked with her over these years and to learn from her. It's really hard to overstate the importance of her research and work on these collections. In today's lecture, Joanna is going to talk to you more about this gallery and some of the work that went into it. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Joanna Smith.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Jane, for those introductions. And Sarah, I have to say that the feeling is mutual. Some of you may not know that this kind of work is a highly collaborative enterprise, and Sarah and I have already begun collaborating on several aspects of the ancient collection, including the collection of ancient gems in the Gave collection. And we already have one article out, and it's really been an adventure trying to trace back the collection history of those objects. And we continue to work together on several aspects of the collection. So I'm just going to set up that timer there so that I don't run over. I also would just like to thank my colleagues overall at the Ringling, who are too numerous to name individually here. But from the very first, when I came in 2014, Stephen High was very welcoming and was very adventurous in accepting the proposal that I put forth for Gallery 12. And I'm so glad that the responses have so far been so very positive. So, and Jane, I'm just going to return your glasses here so I don't flip them over onto the floor. Yeah, so and it's really been an exciting project for me, and I'm pleased to see you all here today. So let's talk about Gallery 12 and what my title is all about, Facing Antiquity. So facing antiquity is a subject that I chose as the focus for my talk, because no matter how you enter Gallery 12, your first experience of this space is not a chronological sequence, is not a map. It is the experience of the artwork itself. You are immersed from the get-go in the arts of the island of Cyprus, whether it is the sanctuary at Golgoi that you see on the left, or a sequence of funerary sculpture as you see on the right. And this is deliberate in order that your first encounter with the gallery be with the artworks itself, so that you can learn to appreciate them on a visceral level before you begin to learn some of the nuts and bolts of the geography of the region, the chronology, and the history. And so this is, I think, a very unusual way of presenting a gallery. Now, Facing Antiquity has three faces for us today. The first one is facing up to antiquity, our responsibilities as curators of collections of antiquities, and how it is that they are presented to the public, but also how it is that they are collected in the first place. The second part is about facing antiquity and delving further into that idea of the experience of ancient art in the gallery itself, but also that experience as it was in the past, what these objects mean, how that they operated within the ancient context. And then the third part is about facing antiquity, literally the faces, but also the people overall, really trying to get to know them through the many sculpted representations that we see in the gallery. And we are going to be starting with collection history. And collection history is something that is very important for us to pursue as stewards of collections. And this has many parts. It includes both how objects are unearthed in the first place, how they are collected and preserved in museums, but also how they're presented to the public through galleries, through publications, through online resources. And so we're going to be focusing in on particularly the collections in the gallery that come from the island of Cyprus. But when you're in the gallery, I invite you to explore the touchpad to learn about the many collections that we've unearthed so far through the research for the gallery, showing the many different strands of John Ringling's collection and then objects that came into the collection later, particularly a tomb group that was excavated in a scientific manner in 1961 by an Australian team of archaeologists. So let us, however, begin with a map, just so that we can situate ourselves. Everything in this gallery comes from the region of the Mediterranean Sea area, the Western Asia to the eastern part of the slide on the left, and Egypt. And the majority of the 3,300 plus objects in the collection of ancient art here at the Ringling come from the island of Cyprus. Over 2,300 pieces come from this island, which you can see in the center of the slide at the left. This is the third largest island in the Mediterranean, the third most populous island in the Mediterranean, and it is roughly the size of the state of Connecticut, which gives you a sense of how big it is. But even if it seems a little bit small in relationship to states like Florida and the larger United States, it's a highly complex place that was sought after for many of its natural resources, such as the copper that is in the foothills of its Troodos Mountains. This is a major resource that began to be used in a major way in the 3rd millennium BC, which is right about the beginning of what we're looking at in the gallery. The gallery covers a chronological range from about 2,500 BC to about 500 CE or AD, depending on which terminology you use. And so copper is one of those major resources that made Cyprus famous, and in fact the name of Cyprus refers to that material. Cyprus was also known for its timber. It was famous in antiquities for its textile manufacturers. Some of the few named artists from the island are tapestry specialists. And so it's a very complex place with a long history. And it was sought after by many mainland powers who wished to take over the island in order to control its resources. But through its long history, it was not until Alexander the Great and the end of the 4th century BC that Cyprus began to be subsumed within a larger mainland enterprise. And Alexander's generals, who ruled from Egypt, incorporated Cyprus within their empire that was called the Ptolemaic Empire. So who found the majority of the objects that we have here in the collection that come from Cyprus? Well, not all, but nearly all of those pieces were found by this gentleman, Luigi Palma di Cesnola. Cesnola was of Italian origin, and by training, he was a military man. He was a highly skilled military man who, upon emigration to the United States, he started a military academy, and he later served in the Union Army during the Civil War. And it was after his service in the Civil War that he was awarded the post of U.S. consul in Cyprus. And he then served in that role from 1865 to 1876. And he sold the majority of his collection of antiquities from Cyprus to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And you see him standing here on the right with some of his antiquities when he was living in Cyprus. And on the left, you see him at the Metropolitan during his tenure as that museum's first director, which he served in that post from 1879 until his death in 1904. And so he was a highly colorful character. He was not a scholar, and we're going to have a quick look at a couple of views of his excavations. And as you can see, it's archaeology at a distance. He is not an uneducated man. He had a classical education. He knew the ancient authors. And in Cyprus, once he became involved in antiquities, he aimed to try to locate all of the ancient cities that were mentioned in ancient texts. So that was his purported goal. When he first started, however, and took up his post as U.S. consul, he knew very little about antiquities, if anything at all. And he first tried to engage the federal government of this country in appreciating the resources of Cyprus by trying to get them to enjoy the fine wine of the island. He was particularly interested in commanderia, which is a form of port that is very popular on Cyprus. He also tried to interest them in wool and many of the other kinds of things that Cyprus was famous for. But all of these offers fell flat. Until he began to talk about the excitement of some of the antiquities that were being discovered by other diplomats on the island. A very, very large limestone amphora, much bigger than I can even encompass with my arms, had recently left the island, having been discovered by French diplomats, and is now a fixture in the Louvre Museum in Paris, if any of you have ever seen that. So this was very exciting, and he wrote to the U.S. government about it, and this got a response. And so he continued to get further and further and further into explorations on Cyprus, collecting antiquities to keep up the interest, because the U.S. government considered Cyprus not to be of particularly importance, and they kept threatening to shut down the consulate, which would have left him without a job, without a post, without a position in society. So he kept doing this, and in order to keep that up, he also had to begin to sell antiquities, and it was a bit of a vicious circle for him. As somebody involved in exploring for antiquities, he hired many local men one of whom we think became an actually very renowned man involved in many later excavations, and we're only beginning to learn more about the people that formed his team. As you can see on the right, he was very systematic, with almost military precision, organizing people to carry out explorations for tombs by hitting the ground and listening for hollow sounds to locate a tomb. But nevertheless, he's almost always shown at a distance. He has very few records that he's left in terms of notebooks that were taken on site. He does have reports that he submits, but they're very often lists of objects by material rather than the kind of excavation reports that we expect today, where you have very carefully recorded the location of every item that you find in the ground so that you can fully reconstruct the context after the fact. Because, of course, archaeology, as wonderful as it is destruction. Once you've excavated it, you can't, we call it re-excavation, but it's not really. You can go back and revisit a site and do more, but you can't really go back and fully re-excavate once you've removed the soil and the objects from that context. So he's a very colorful character, but he does have some of his sort of good sides. And one of the things that I have found particularly interesting, both working here and for the Metropolitan, is the opportunity to do so much archival research. And both in government dispatches, as on the left, and in his voluminous personal correspondence, every time I uncover it, there are just hundreds of archives around the country that have bits and pieces of this correspondence, and we learn all the ins and outs of how he attempted to get permits for excavation and tried to have the appropriate permits for export of the objects. So it's a much more complex story than you usually read about. We also learn about, he consults with many scholars of the time, such as Charles Eliot Norton, as you see on the right, who's the founder of the Archaeological Institute of America, seeking advice on how to present his finds in publication, asking for feedback on chapters, and the like. And so there's so many angles. And in this, we also learn about his very close personal friend, Hiram Hitchcock, who was a wealthy financier and hotel owner in New York, who kept encouraging him to continue his excavations, that he would, get the interest of the then new Metropolitan Museum of Art. And this was sort of lit a fire under him as a potential sort of post-consul activity for him. So these archives are everywhere, and research is ongoing to try to learn more of the nuanced picture about this very complex character. He had a very generous nature. He shared his information freely, and in fact, one of the most interesting things that I've found is that his writings and letters often served as the fodder for other writers, as on the left. So Charles Dudley Warner, who lived in Hartford and was a close friend of Mark Twain, wrote this book, In the Levant, among other publications. And the chapter in this book about Cyprus is almost verbatim from Cesnola's letters to him, with no credit given to Cesnola. But Cesnola seems not to have minded and considered this man a close friend and confidant. In fact, letters to him show that Cesnola changed his mind about some of his reportings, admitted some of his own mistakes to this man. So it's a very valuable body of material. And then Cesnola's own book, Cyprus, Its Ancient Cities, Tombs, and Temples, really reads more like a travelogue, more like a book like In the Levant than an excavation report. And when he goes to try to publish his atlas, which is his sort of magnum opus once he's in New York at the Metropolitan, we know from letters that he wanted to try to present the material more in a landscape perspective with illustrations of the sites, but that various of the trustees advised him against it, that he should use photography, it should be a very accurate presentation of the objects, and it ends up becoming publications by material, very much like his original lists that he was keeping in Cyprus. No matter how valuable these are, they really are catalogs by material. So it's a very interesting process to delve into collection history, and we know that he was interested in sharing the objects with the public. His own home in Larnaca, Cyprus, served as one of the very first museums in Cyprus. It was a de rigueur stop on the tour of the Levant to stop there and see his antiquities. And once stationed at the Metropolitan, he was very engaged with visitor experience. So there are things to say about Cesnola that are both positive and negative. It's not simply a matter of skilled military man versus unskilled archaeologist. So, and you can learn more in Gallery 12. How about John Ringling? So the objects that we have from Cyprus largely come from Cesnola's excavations, but they're brought here by John Ringling. And John Ringling purchased nearly his entire collection of over 3,000 antiquities in the year 1928. Some of them came from the sale of the Gave collection, small gems and the like, but most of them came from two sales at the Anderson Galleries in March and April of 1928. And we know that John Ringling attended these sales in person. In fact, on the left, you can see how he's written out how to pronounce Cypriot at the top. And we have both volumes 1 and 2 of the catalog annotated by John Ringling with X's marking objects that he thought he wanted to buy in many instances, comments on good if cheap kind of thing, prices and the like. And you'll recognize some of the heads that are on display in Gallery 12 over there at the left. Now, John Ringling had every intent of building a separate museum building for this collection. He reports that in an interview that he gave for the Christian Science Monitor in 1928. But sadly, the stock market crash of 1929, his wife Mabel's death in the same year, and his own failing health made it such that that never happened. But as a good steward of antiquities, his intent was to put them on display. As you know, the collection went into receivership, but then with the hiring of Chick Austin, one of the first things he does is he uncrates this collection of objects. And Tara Johnson, who is one of the conservators here, showed me a wonderful set of photographs yesterday that I think come from the moment of that uncrating, which is very exciting. But we have this article that Sarah Cartwright and one of her assistants found from 1948 that shows when the objects first went on display in the loggia. And here you can see a couple of views of that display, and they remained on view until 1981. With some objects having come inside, but there was a very long period where the objects were a fixture in the loggia, sadly outside, but at the Art Museum on view. Chick Austin also solidified the connection with Cyprus through the acquisition of the Asolo Theater, which was originally built into the castle of Queen Caterina Cornaro, who had been the Queen of Cyprus in the late 15th century. And so everywhere you go on Cyprus, both sides of the Ringling campus, you will encounter a Cypriot connection. After the objects were brought inside, in the 1980s and 1990s, there continued to be displayed, including a traveling exhibition organized by Norma Kershaw, whom you see at the left at the top. And if somebody knows the name of the woman up there, is that Betty Telford? If somebody recognizes her, please tell me after the lecture. And on the right in the Astor Gallery, there was a fine display, part of which was organized by Pam Russell. And as you know, we have pieces that are on view in Gallery 17 and in the Center for Asian Art as kind of a teaser for Gallery 12. And I'm so pleased that these flank both sides of the points of entrance to the gallery. On to Facing Antiquity in the gallery. So we're going to be talking about one of two sanctuaries. And there are two sanctuaries featured in the gallery. One is from a site in central Cyprus called Golgoi in the limestone foothills, and the other one is from southern Cyprus at Kourion. And today we're centering on Golgoi. And this is Chesnola's most famous discovery. The night of March 6th in 1870, he says that he got a notification in the middle of the night that he had to rush out to the site from Larnaca, and that the men who were working for him had uncovered this monumental head of a man. And this is the head over here. It's only 88 centimeters. It's quite large, but it certainly is not man height, as shown over here in this illustration. But nevertheless, an exciting find. And what it was that they'd uncovered was not a building, but it was a giant pit with many, many fragments of sculpture. And we know more about it than both from his own reports, but also from accounts by contemporary diplomats who confirm or sort of contradict some of the things that Chesnola tells us. But what he found is something very similar to what I found in my own excavations as part of the team from Princeton at Polis. And this is a large pit cut into the limestone bedrock, and this is a 5-meter grid here. So this is a 5-meter wide pit in the ground, 3 meters deep, and there was more pottery and terracotta sculpture in there than dirt. And it took us many years to excavate it properly with everything having been recorded. And at the very top, in addition to the objects being packed in throughout, at the very top, there were some very special deposits of sculpture that had been very carefully buried in relationship to large storage amphorae, some of them having been deliberately broken. This woman's head was screwed off and pulled out in order to give her a ritual killing so that nobody else could use the power of this dedicated object. This is a votive sculpture meant to stand in for a worshiper before the deity. And in this case, it's the goddess of Cyprus. Very exciting, and something where I was just telling somebody the other day, we had to protect this and sleep outside during the excavation in order to keep people away from it. So Chesnola also found to the east of that a structure, actually a stone-built structure. And we know that it had all kinds of sculpture found inside of it, and it had some form of statue bases. There were a couple of large stone amphorae, not as large as the one the French had exported, but still quite large at the two doors to the building. But in his reporting of this, from his 1871 official report to the government through to a report that he gave in Turin, near where he was born in the same year, to his final published plan, there are changes in proportion and scale and detail. And so just like everything with him, you don't know exactly what was found. But he does say that it was packed with sculpture, that they come from all different time periods, and that objects were grouped by dress. That he reported that those who appeared to be in Egyptian dress seemed to be standing closer to one another, and so on. And so, lest we think that this is fanciful, we know that such crowds existed. This is from an excavation from 1929 by the Swedish Cyprus expedition, which was an extraordinary scientific enterprise all around the island from 1927 to 1931. And they uncovered this crowd of 2,000 male terracotta sculptures that were still in place, standing around an altar. And in fact, they didn't recognize it until afterwards, but the round stone they found on top of this altar was an aniconic or without image representation of the deity. And as you can see, they're organized. You've got large ones and small ones and miniature ones. Chariot groups are grouped together. Men are roughly grouped by the particulars of their dress. And this recalls very much the kinds of statements that Chesnola made about his find. Today, this collection is divided between the Cyprus Museum in Nicosia, which preserves that sort of circular arrangement of it. It's a very effective display, and they're going to keep that in their new museum to open in a few years. And on the right is the Medelhavsmuseet in Stockholm, where they've used a mirror to double the objects to try to make it look like they have all 2,000 sculptures. So it's pretty fabulous. So I have used these kinds of concepts to inform the display in Gallery 12, choosing to allow you to have this experience of not only exploring Cesnola, but also by being confronted with something that allows you to encounter the kind of grouping that might have been on display in such an ancient sanctuary, something that draws you in. And as in the ideas, Elias Canetti, who wrote a wonderful book on crowds and power, here you find a group of objects that are all sort of engaging in the crowd, coming together through a common purpose, which is to stand before the deity, and yet they all have differences, so that within that crowd, those differences keep the dynamics of the crowd going. And so it is a very long-term enterprise, something where objects were continually being added over time, some pieces being removed and placed in the votive pit, but it was not a single display only for a couple of years. This is something that was up for hundreds of years and really was a powerful, meaningful grouping, no matter exactly how it was in the actual temple. We don't know the exact locations of them, but this is something that's drawing on those ideas to pull you in. And so you can start at the top and be on par with the colossal statues, and then walk down the stairs or take the lift and join the group at the human scale. And you can also go down to the lower level and engage with the miniature figures. And you can begin to appreciate the many highly fragmentary pieces of sculpture. And this is not simply because people didn't appreciate an intact sculpture. These are often deliberately broken by invading armies, or, as I said before, the deliberate killing of these objects to take away their power so that nobody else could dedicate your sculpture before the deity. And everything in the crowd is placed at the appropriate elevation where it would have been on a larger scale sculpture. And so you can get immersed in the crowd itself, learning about it, and you can pull back and you can think about it in relationship to the funerary sculpture just next to it, which are many of which are from a cemetery that is also at Golgoi. And these three pieces on the edge of the group are, in fact, funerary sculptures that Cesnola says come from the sanctuary. And did he make a mistake? Or were they actually rededicated? And we know that sculptures were reused, uncovered, often hundreds of years later, and reused in many different ways. So it's a very dynamic group, and I hope you will enjoy exploring it in the gallery. But let's get to know the people a little bit better. So what about these individual votive sculptures? So here we have one of a man who is clearly wearing an Egyptian kilt here. He has this wonderful pectoral necklace. He has an armlet here. And he has a beautiful helmet that is both a combination of a military helmet and almost a crown of Upper Egypt back here. And he has got these wonderful spiral earrings, which is a very Cypriot fashion, and his arm, had it been preserved, would have been in a typical gesture of worship. He's so three-dimensional on the front, and yet when he turns to the side, he flattens out. And at the back, there's a little bit of detail. This is actually a lot for a Cypriot sculpture. Usually they're completely flat. And these are very powerful objects that, as I say, were dedicated as stand-ins for the worshiper before the deity. And their very changing aspect from a three-dimensional to a two-dimensional view is something that allows them to kind of pass between different kind of scales, different kinds of dimensions. And in that way, they serve as a very, very powerful conduit for communicating between you in the earthly level and the divine. And we can then also look at funerary sculpture, which is equally powerful. But you'll notice in the displays of funerary sculpture that when you have figural representation, it is mostly within a two-dimensional frame. It's within a stela. It's very much like a portal, and you can't enter that portal. These people are there, you can communicate with them, but you have this kind of, there's always a bit of a veil between you and these individuals. And so both the stelae, which is not the main focus of this talk, and the votive sculptures are very powerful ways for people to communicate, on the one hand with their deities, and on the other hand with their ancestors. But let's have a look at how we can identify these people, even without a head. One of the best things I heard in the gallery was somebody said, but they don't have heads. Why do they do that? Well, they do that often to remove the power of the statue in a destruction context. But in any case, even without her head, this wonderful woman here from Kurion tells a lot about herself. She has this fabulous necklace here, which includes this long pendant strand that has these 4 objects hanging from it. And these are finger rings with little scarabs on them. These are objects that would be used to make an impression in clay or wax to show her responsibility in a temple context. And this is right around 500 BC. When you get down to the 3rd century, these would be replaced by temple keys. And this is a priestess who is wearing her badges of office. So we learn a lot about her. By contrast, this young boy over here, he's also wearing a strand that includes some of these scarab rings, but this time these are protective amulets. And this is a young boy that would be dedicated in a sanctuary context. Usually these boys are bearing their genitals, and that is because they are dedicated as part of a circumcision ritual. So these are part of a Semitic practice that we find on Cyprus, but also all the way over in the Western Mediterranean as part of the Phoenician and Punic traditions. So looking at the details of these objects, we can say a lot about who they are and their positions in society. In the gallery, we only have 2 named individuals that accompany an image. We have some other names in the gallery, but they don't go along with the figural image. On the left, we have an Etruscan scarab. So these are the kinds of objects that would be worn by the priestess or by the temple boy when set into a finger ring. And that could serve as either an administrative tool or an amulet. And on the left, we have an Etruscan scarab that has the name of Tamun on it, or Daemon. And it may be the name of the owner, or the name of the athlete represented, or maybe the owner and the athlete are the same. We just don't know. On the right, we have another person where we know the name. It's not inscribed, but this is King Mithridates, who ruled in northern Turkey in the first century BC. And he has this fabulous head of hair, which some of you may recognize as something that looks an awful lot like Alexander the Great. And indeed, here's Alexander the Great in a coin. And in fact, his portraits of Alexander were best known through coinage, which circulated more so than larger scale sculpture. during his lifetime and in the years afterwards. But he was known particularly for this sort of wonderful, sort of slightly upward gaze, and in a three-dimensional aspect, a sort of tilted head, this sort of vaguely romantic look, with this marvelous head of hair, usually with this wonderful curls at the top. And here he has the lion's head with the mane of the lion echoing the way in which Alexander's hair also would fly back at the back. And his generals, who took over control of Cyprus after his death, echo the same kind of hairstyle, together with the curl at the top, with this wonderful swirl of thick curly locks. And each of them has slightly different facial details that allows us to see these as portraits, even as they use the ideal form of Alexander as their kind of veil to sort of present themselves in a way that references their former leader. And as you can see, Mithridates, who is in the gallery, in fact, it's when his ring is used to make an official impression that he really turns and begins to reflect the common view of Alexander facing to the right. Within the crowd, we do have a figure who uses this kind of guise of Alexander as part of his self-presentation amongst sculptures of the Hellenistic period from the 3rd through the 1st centuries BC, which is really when this idea of portraiture and this kind of balance between ideal and likeness come into play. So this figure here, that when first published, people said that this was a female sculpture. This is, in fact, a sculpture of a young man, and you can see here the turn of the head, the slightly upward gaze, and you can see that marvelous thick swirl of hair at the back, which really recalls very much the form, the hairstyles of the rulers of Cyprus who followed Alexander. And at the front, though, he's got a marvelous set of curls, does not have a single curl at the front. And so clearly this is a person who is using that frame of reference to Alexander, but that this is not a representation of Alexander himself, wearing the usual wreath, typical of dress at this time, pulling on Greek styles. At the same time, we also have pieces in the collection that are referencing forms of portraiture that harken more to likeness, in a sense. Because here we have a man who has this very long head, has a very heavy brow, has closely set eyes, very distinctive features that separate him out from other sculptures. And so there is this dynamic in terms of self-representation when we have this idea of portraiture, a balance between ideal forms and individual characteristic traits, all of which tell us a story about the individuals behind them. And some of these kinds of ideal forms serve almost the same kind of role as what we call attributes. So when you come to try to identify a deity, as on the left, this wonderful statuette of Artemis that's in the gallery, we know that this is Artemis because she has a quiver of arrows. She's got her either deer or hunting dog here by her side. Just as we know that this is a temple boy from his string of amulets, his pose, and the like. And yet there are other things that help us see them together. So for example, they both have these large heads in relationship to bodies, these sort of chubby features. And here this is appropriate for this boy being a youth. But here it is more symbolic, and it references the fact that she is a protector of children. So this idea of things that stand in and may in some cases be indicative of an individual, but may hearken to the sort of attributes or a guise of somebody that you want to reference in your sculpture, extends also to female sculpture, and this is a piece in the crowd, one of my favorites. This is a cornucopia, or a horn of plenty. And the double cornucopia was the symbol of Queen Arsinoe, who was the wife and sister of one of the male rulers of Cyprus that followed Alexander the Great. And one of the sculptures from Golgoi was carrying a cornucopia, which interestingly, it's a single cornucopia, but it has two cakes at the top. And each of her cornucopias, it's a double cornucopia with one cake in each one. And here there are two cakes. It's almost like it's a shorthand for referencing an allegiance with or some kind of a reference to Queen Arsinoe. But let's go a little bit further back in time. Alexander, he was an influencer par excellence, and he influenced, from his time for hundreds of years to come. But what happened before that, and who are these other people who are from periods in time before people were wearing Greek wreaths and the like? What about these giant colossal sculptures at the top? Well, the very first influencer, not to say there was nobody earlier than that, but the first one who really put a foot on the ground in Cyprus and left a big mark is Sargon II, who is an Assyrian ruler at the end of the 8th century BC. And he literally had a foothold in that he has a statue of himself erected on the south coast of the island in the ancient city of Kition, which is the modern city of Larnaca. And later on, it got kind of bashed in at the face and the hands and the scepter. Clearly, some Cypriots weren't terribly pleased to have that there. But nonetheless, this is a major statement. And it's interesting that in the subsequent century, men start to sport these very elaborate, very thick beards that hearken to the Assyrian style, with all kinds of details of curly hair. And these military caps also have a kind of a reference to Assyrian styles. And yet each one of these, so this is the head found by Cesnola on March 6, 1870, but these are the two that are in our crowd, and they're all roughly the same scale. But you can see that each one has a slightly different beard, slightly different facial details, and as you look at each one and try to match them up, each time you make a connection, it's, oh, well, no, that's actually slightly different. So these are all monumental, probably as high as 10 feet high, and they reference powerful men of their time, but they're not all the same. And so clearly there are many individuals who are making dedications and are competing with one another within this space. And Assyrian style really gave them a lot of kind of powerful ways to do that. And what's really curious about this is that it remains a popular style even after the fall of the Assyrian Empire in 612 BC. This man is definitely after the fall of the Assyrian Empire, and yet he's wearing the wonderful woolly cloak here. He's got the armbands, so you can see an example over here from Khorsabad, from the palace of Sargon II, with the wonderful fleecy cloak here, and here are the armbands. And the sort of thick hair at the back. He's got the wonderful thick hair and the big thick beard. And so this remains a very powerful way of self-presentation, even after the Assyrian Empire is no more. As we look at the crowd, there are other forms of dress, and the one that I think we should address before we close is Egypt, because we see that throughout. You see kilts in there, you see wigs, you see Egyptian forms of jewelry, and this happens in the 6th century BC during the time of a pharaoh called Amasis, and this is just a tiny little head that's in the Metropolitan's collection of that pharaoh. But we know that he laid claim to having made dedications at sanctuaries throughout Cyprus. He did not control Cyprus in a governmental way, but he seems to have made many dedications. We don't know what particularly they were, but we know there's at least one object with his name on it found actually in the town where I conducted my excavations. And there are many, many, many Egyptian or Egyptianizing objects from this time, including this fabulous piece of relief sculpture from the sanctuary building that I showed you before where I worked, which is either an import from Egypt or an Egyptian artist working with Cypriot limestone. And we haven't yet been able to determine which that is. But Egyptian styles were prevalent on the island, and on the right-hand side you see the head of one of the figures in the crowd who's wearing a form of the Egyptian wig. He does not have the royal insignia as you see on the pharaoh himself, but this wonderful wig here, and work by Emily Brown, one of the conservators, confirmed that this head does in fact go with the body, which is very exciting because the body is not wearing an Egyptian outfit, as we will see in a moment. What's interesting when we look at this face is that the details of the face, yes, it's slightly different, but in many ways, there's a big crossover with his pal over here, who's very similar in time period, who has chosen to wear a Syrian dress. And so the choices that people had made for the kinds of sculpted representations that they wanted to stand in for them in sanctuary spaces very much define them. They formed the headgear, the hairstyles, the dress styles. This is how they chose to present themselves before the god and before their fellow community workers. And to further underline that despite the similarity in the faces that these are individuals, is that on the hand of this man, there are two signs in the syllabic script of Cyprus preserved, and one of them is not very legible, but the other one is the syllable se, which is the typical last syllable of a personal name. And had he not been wearing such a voluminous cloak that wrapped his arm, he probably would have had his name written on his arm, which is the more typical location. So as we look at these three pieces that I plucked out of the crowd, you can see that here we've got a man who's wearing an Egyptian wig, but this wonderful Cypriot cloak. This man here is, as we discussed, wearing a very Assyrian type of outfit from head to at least midsection. We don't know about his toes because it's not preserved. And in the middle, we have this man who on first glance looks like he's got an Egyptian kilt. He's got this wonderful Egyptianizing pectoral necklace. And yet he has that armlet on the arm that really recalls Assyrian fashions. He's got a helmet that is a combination of that cap and the crown of Upper Egypt. And either side, for good measure, is a lotus, which references both Egypt and Phoenicia. And at the back, he has a wonderfully sort of Assyrian head of hair together with Cypriot earrings. So nothing is ever absolutely derived solely from one location. It's all brought in, made their own, and is a way of bringing themselves into the community, creating how they wish to be presented. And so when we face antiquity through looking at the faces and the bodies of these individuals, we have to look at all of these different kinds of details. So I encourage you, as you look through the gallery, to try to face antiquity yourselves and think about collection history, think about the experience of the artworks, and think about the people that populated these ancient places, some of whom are now populating Gallery 12. Thank you.
It's not really literature, but is there written evidence from these time periods, contemporary written evidence from the people that did these sculptures, and so that you know more, how you know?
Okay, how do I know? So we don't, so for Cyprus, we have some accounts that are preserved by ancient Greek authors. So we have some Bronze Age texts as well, but we're not going to go back that far because we weren't really talking about the Bronze Age. So Homer references Cyprus, talks about the fact that there's a temple of Aphrodite there. Herodotus gives us many aspects of ancient history. There's another ancient author, Diodorus, who gives us aspects of ancient history. And some of these people are writing hundreds of years after events. So that's one way. Another way is inscriptions that are found on the island. And so Cyprus, unlike Egypt, where you have papyrus and things like that survive, and they may very well have been writing. In fact, we know they were writing on skins because we have representations of scribes who are holding some kind of perishable material. We also know that they were writing on wax tablets because you see statues that were holding wax tablets. And we have a wonderful bronze tablet that's an imitation of such a tablet that preserves one of our longest Cypriot texts that comes from the city of Idalion and tells us something about the history of that city. But it's really in the form of stone inscriptions, as well as some inscriptions on pottery shards, things like that. And so in the western part of the island, you have a lot of funerary steles, so we can say a lot about the individual names of the people. And when we look in more of the sort of area of Kition, it's no surprise that the area where the Assyrians made their biggest mark, where the Phoenicians sort of served as agents for the Assyrians and helped to maintain control over time of the city of Kition. Kition is one of the places with the most voluminous number of inscriptions. In addition to the stele of Sargon, we have many, many Phoenician inscriptions from there. And we learn through these inscriptions from Kition, but also the city of Idalion, and then another city called Tamasos, about the kings of the area, and also how eventually the king of Kition eventually takes over and controls not only Kition but Idalion and Tamasos. It has the whole sort of central swath of the island all the way to the copper mines. So you can, it's not a narrative per se that's written out as a history, but you can piece it together from these sources of evidence.
Created these objects? Was there a high art in Cyprian sculpture? That's one question.
Yeah. So when I first started working on the collection, it was thought that the majority of pieces were Chisnella. And the first one, like within the first week, there was an Etruscan mirror. And I said, well, I think it's highly unlikely that this is a Chisnella object. Not impossible, I suppose, but it seemed highly unlikely. And had been well published, but the person who published it also was puzzled by that. And so through Joan Mertens, who is now a retired curator in the Department of Greek and Roman Art at the Metropolitan, I said, well, and in fact, I have to thank her because when I first started coming here, I was invited to come initially by the then designer for the reinstallation project who had worked at the Met and was a friend of Joan's, and Joan was a friend of mine. He asked her to do it, and she said she couldn't, and she recommended me. So I have to thank Joan. Big thank you. In any case, she very kindly let me look through their deaccessioned object cards. And I found that object, and I found that it was from the collection of Arthur Lincoln Frothingham, who was a Princeton professor and had been at the American Academy of Rome, and he had served as a purchaser of antiquities in Italy for various museums, including the Metropolitan, but also the Penn Museum, and so on. And so we now know that that mirror is from his collection. And very similar lines of inquiry allowed me to identify several other collections, and they're profiled in that touchpad in the gallery, and that work continues, and we're finding new information all the time. In fact, Sarah and I found some new information just the other day. So that's a very exciting line of inquiry. So, and the catalog itself doesn't always say exactly what collection things are from, so you really have to do the sleuthing to find it. So as for the ancient sculptures, we have very few sculptures on Cyprus where we know the name of the person who made it. There's a couple of pieces from the Hellenistic and Roman period that have a signature, but earlier on we don't have the names in the majority of cases. There's one piece from the south coast of Cyprus that has a name on it, but it's very, very, very rare. But the objects from Golgoi, they're from an area that is so rich in limestone that it's being quarried practically on site. And people who carved the limestone from the area said that when it's initially carved, it cuts like butter. And so it's a very easy stone to carve in its initial form. And in the Larnaca Museum, you can see some pieces that were roughly carved out and were never finished, which is very interesting. And it's clear that there's a certain amount of rough cutting that's done, and then the pieces are transported and further work is done. Now, exactly how you had your sculpture made, whether you dictated to the sculptor exactly what you wanted or whether there were some that were sort of prefab. And there are, in some of the smaller pieces, there's a lot of regularity. So I suggest that those, in many cases, are sort of prefab, and that you could buy them right there, just like some of the terracotta figurines from figurine to figurine. They're extraordinarily similar. And the thinking is that you could pick up, your figurine and make your dedication, on your way to the sanctuary. Some of the larger ones, though, I think have to have been commissioned because it would have been a much larger enterprise to have that work created. So we don't know the names in the majority of cases, but there are people who have done work, Derek Counts, for example, Pam Gaber. There's many people who have worked on Cypriot sculpture as their main focus who have attempted to try to figure out, the different groupings of them, but it can be hard to separate them out. But you can kind of tell, I work in a part of the island in Polis where limestone is not the primary resource, and we have some limestone sculptures, but William Childs, who's worked on it, it's a very different body of material from what you're seeing in the central limestone hills area. There we have primarily terracotta sculpture, which is also a wonderful art form on Cyprus, highly creative and different. There's been a little bit more success in identifying workshops, I think.
I wonder if you could shed some light on what the Cypriot government restrictions or laws were at the time of Cesnoa's excavations, as to whether there were any limits on what could be excavated and what could be exported.
At the time that Cesnoa was consul in Cyprus, Cyprus was under Ottoman rule, and there were Antiquity's laws of the time, and if you read through the various letters and things, he has made quite an effort in order to navigate that system and have the appropriate permits. Now, like other diplomats of the time, you can't always find the precise trail of the exact permit that went with each shipment. And famously, there's one instance where he is denied the ability to export as the American or the U.S. consul. He also served, however, as the Russian consul. And he made that export under his privilege as the Russian consul. So, yeah, it's a very complicated, it's an important question, but a very complicated story. And that's sort of a preview into the answer to that.
Thank you so much.
I'm very curious about the large groupings of statues that you said you collected or arranged over many years and facing an altar. Does this happen anywhere else besides Cyprus? And do we know what deity they were facing?
So both the sanctuaries featured in the gallery, Kourion and Golgoi, are dedicated to the god who is known eventually as the god Apollo by the time you get to the late classical and Hellenistic period, just as sanctuaries to the goddess are eventually known as sanctuaries of Aphrodite. Yes, there are other votive crowds, and the idea of the crowd goes back, you see it in Mesopotamia, and any of you who are familiar with Mesopotamian sculpture of the 3rd millennium with the giant eyes and things like that, I mean, these are really, they're smaller pieces, smaller crowds, smaller physical pieces, but they have a very similar kind of significance in standing. And they have this very characteristic way of posture and so on. So yes, you see it in Mesopotamia, and you have dedications, certainly. I mean, there were, so for example, in the classical period, the Athenian Acropolis, today we see it, it's got lots of temple buildings and things like that. But throughout that Acropolis site, there would have also been sculptures erected, which are no longer standing there today. You have to see them in the local museum. And many of them, in fact, come from a pit, a votive pit that was with the burial of sculptures after the Persian destruction of the Athenian Acropolis. So you see crowds both east and west, but the crowds in Cyprus are extraordinary for the sheer number of the pieces and for their extraordinarily crowded form, really cheek by jowl. We have some space in Gallery 12 because, museum conditions, it really wouldn't be safe to have them touching in that way. But in the original context, they were, really tightly packed. Well, thank you very much for having me.